Shams Charania replacing his mentor, Adrian Wojnarowski, the man who brought him into this wild world of insider news breaking at Yahoo Sports almost a decade ago now, and who is now running the St. Bonaventure's men's basketball program, leaving this hole for Shams Charania to take over. What did you make of this news?
It was kind of, obvious thing happens. Like we talked about this. We did an emergency podcast when Woj retired, and we both agreed, like, if the goal in replacing Woj is to actually replace Woj, then there's only one answer, and it's Shams Charania. I mean, these are the two preeminent newsbreakers in the NBA space. I think you could argue they're largely interchangeable in terms of how many stories they break and the magnitude of the stories they break. And, when one breaks a story, the other one is right behind them. And it's not, I don't, at least I don't feel this way. I don't feel like there's a defined pecking order between the two. So it was kind of fortuitous that Woj retired at a time where Shams was set to become a free agent after leaving The Athletic and FanDuel TV and Stadium. But I thought this was the most obvious outcome. It maybe dragged out a little bit longer than I thought. And I thought that, some of the reporting with Jeff Passan possibly being involved, or even Adam Schefter being involved, I thought that was a little strange, but I thought this was always the destination we were going to arrive at.
We called it, right? I mean, I think we both said if they are going to hire a replacement, which wasn't always a given, there was some early rumors that maybe they would just stick with their pretty considerable stable that already was employed. Brian Windhorst, Ramona Shelburne, Tim Bontemps, Tim McMahon, those types of folks. Once they chose to replace Woj in a real way, this was, to me, the only place that made sense to go. Shams has TV experience. He's been doing things for FanDuel. He's been on the Pat McAfee show for years. He is on Stadium doing interviews and live hits for their studio programming, so he at least has the reps there, like you mentioned, in the actual nitty-gritty of sourcing and breaking the news and having real information to kind of bring to air and write about. He's the only one who can hold a candle to Woj. So nothing about this is necessarily a surprise. What I think might be different, though, in terms of you feeling like they're equal, they are in their stature maybe, but not, I think, in how they could be utilized or the ways in which we'll see them kind of deployed by ESPN. So Stephen A. Smith on his podcast on Monday evening teased that Shams Charania will be on ESPN airwaves starting Thursday, right away this week. How do you think they can use Shams differently than they did with Woj? What do you think might be, from like a NBA fan perspective or somebody who watches ESPN perspective, the tangible difference in what this shakeup will actually mean?
I think he has a little more personality than Woj had. Woj was a reporter who was good enough to do TV, but I don't think, I think like somebody like Brian Windhorst is a reporter who's really, really good at TV. I thought Woj kind of met the bare minimum of somebody ESPN would put on its airwaves in terms of being a newsbreaker, and it helps that his information is as good as it was. I think Shams is better at TV. I think Shams is more of a personality. We've seen that, with the Kay Adams stuff at FanDuel. We've seen that with his appearances on Pat McAfee. So I think we'll see more of Shams on TV than we saw of Woj. But by and large, this is just, I think ESPN trading one newsbreaker for another.
The Kay Adams, Daniel Jones nonsense made its way to my dad. That is how big of a story that became. I don't know why we can't just let women hosts exist without thinking that they're dating everybody that they interview. But someday maybe that will happen. But yeah, look, he's just good. I mean, I think I've thrown this around before, like the pardon my take test. If you can be on that show or the McAfee show and hang and actually be entertaining and play along and not be just like the guy with the stick up his ass like some people are when they end up on those shows, I think that bodes well for you. And I could see Shams opening up opportunities for himself and for ESPN that just they would have never considered with somebody like Woj. Forget who's better or worse or anything like that. It's really just a different vibe for sure. It's the new energy of how I think media works, which brings us to Pat McAfee. I'm torn on whether I think this mattered or not, or how much, or what to make of it at all. Pat McAfee, there was Dan Le Batard ran wild with this when it first happened, that Woj being gone was due to some kind of disrespect from McAfee having Shams on the show, and that's well known. I just didn't think Woj would care. Then there was rumors as the search was going along that McAfee might be pushing for Shams, or that his kind of endorsement might matter here in where ESPN ultimately went. And then here we are. They did go with Shams, his guy. And Pat kind of took a victory lap a little bit, saying, yeah, I sent some texts and this was a no-brainer. This is what ESPN always should have done. Does this show you Pat has some kind of power we didn't know about? Or do you think this actually factored into why they went this way? We can't stop talking about Pat when it comes to ESPN. Did this one actually evolve him at all?
Real quick, just as far as what else Shams is going to bring, one thing I forgot to mention is he's a lot younger. Like, to be 30 years old and to be in this role, like this brings kind of a new, fresh energy to the ESPN newsbreaker game, so to speak. In terms of Pat McAfee, I like where I come down on it is it couldn't have hurt. Like it couldn't have hurt Shams's cause, but I mean, you and I said it, 10 minutes after the news broke, like this was always the most obvious answer. So it's like he could have given ESPN every endorsement in the world. ESPN already wanted Shams Charania. Like Shams didn't necessarily need that endorsement. I don't think
he didn't say hire this kid from Bleacher Report, right?
Right. And I don't even, because I'm like trying to run through it in my head and it's like, okay, well, maybe they are thinking like it's going to be a real pain in the ass if we hire somebody else. And let's just say we hire Jake Fisher from Yahoo, or formerly of Yahoo, and then Pat McAfee's having Shams on every week. Like that's going to suck. They were already dealing with that when it came to Adrian Wojnarowski. So I don't think this factored into ESPN's decision-making, but it also can't hurt. I mean, Pat McAfee is one of ESPN's tentpole talents. He's in there. He's probably one of the 4 or 5 most important talents at ESPN. So if he is putting pressure on the company publicly and privately, it certainly helps Shams' cause. But at the end of the day, like this was the number one candidate the entire time. So, if Pat wants to take his victory lap, it all certainly adds up. But I don't know how you could say that was going to be the deciding factor by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. And in fairness to McAfee, I mean, it's not as if he's had a no ESPN NBA talent rule. It just seems like more so than anything, I think why the dynamic developed that Pat was like siding with Shams was that Shams and Woj had a very clear tension. And so it's probably understood that Pat has this relationship with Shams. He's not going to also start bringing on his chief rival and a guy that he might have a rocky relationship with personally. But the McAfee show has had Brian Windhorst and Kendrick Perkins and Austin Rivers, and I think even like Tim Legler has come on. Like that could have continued. I'm not convinced that if they hired Jake Fisher, Chris Haynes, those guys couldn't have made an appearance, but we will never know because Shams Charania now gets to be part of that whole world and not ruffle any feathers in the process by continuing to be the McAfee show's go-to man. We talked about the economics. Maybe let's close here real quick, Ben. This idea of does an insider have the same financial value as it did close to a decade ago when John Skipper leaves and ESPN makes this huge push to hire the top newsbreaker in every single sport and these gargantuan salary figures that we were hearing about that Woj walked away from. How could he possibly do that and all those sorts of things? John Orand at Puck reports that Shams will make less than half of what Woj was making without, trying to split hairs about a dude's pocketbooks. Just from an ESPN standpoint, does that feel more reasonable to you that this could be kind of where they go from here, is split the difference a little bit?
Yeah, so Woj was reportedly making $7 million a year. That seems high. Like that is like what, like a that's a bench player in the NBA. That's not a minimum contract in the NBA. And so like that to me feels like a vanity hire where it's like, hey, like, we want this guy because we want to stop citing him and his reports at Yahoo. So we're just going to throw a bunch of money at him. I'm sure he didn't start at 7 million, but the point stands. Let's say Shams, if so, Shams at a maximum is making 3.5 or 3. That's more in line with like what you would figure the economics are of this entire situation. So, this seems more reasonable in terms of what you are paying. It's funny because like people will see that headline. I'm actually the one who wrote the story aggregating John's report, and it's like, oh my God, Shams is making less than half. It's like, no, this is like actually a reasonable salary, and I'm sure Shams is just fine making upwards of $3 million at ESPN.
Put it this way, we all heard how much ESPN leaked that Zach Lowe was making an insurmountable amount of money that was nowhere near feasible on their balance sheets, and the world was going to end if they continued to give him that level of money. Shams will still be making double what Zach Lowe is making, right? So it's like
Right.
the economics of those newsbreaker salaries just never quite felt reasonable, and especially in a world where ESPN, I think, is kind of confronting reality about the types of cuts they need to make to be in a better spot going forward. I think this makes a lot of sense. And to circle back to the point you made to start us off, they're not that different, and there's ways that they can use Shams that might actually be more valuable for the future of ESPN. It's kind of just one of those things where, hey, Woj is a really established, credible, experienced veteran guy. You got to pay him a lot of money. Shams just happens to be younger. You get lucky that you can bring on a guy who's probably going to have similar value, not have to pay him so much. I hate to put my management hat on and like be the man here for a minute, but like it might work out for everybody. And I'm sure Shams is not sweating the fact that he's probably being rewarded handsomely versus the freelance million different jobs hats he was wearing previously. So we'll continue to monitor this. Shams will make his appearance this week, and the rest of the musical chairs will probably be settled before long with some of the other names we mentioned.